Hi, it's Pat. For the second video, we're going to be talking about process evaluation. When to do it, why we should do it, what to do, and how. Before we get started, I wanted to remind you about the CDC evaluation cycle. Detailed descriptions of this cycle can be found online, but I think the key things to remember is that evaluation begins at the top of this cycle with engaging stakeholders. Stakeholders need to be involved in every aspect of our evaluation. Another key step is to describe our program through a theory of change, a detailed one, or a logic model. And then the next step is really focusing the evaluation. After that, we gather data, analyze our findings, and then use our results. But I encourage you to read about the evaluation cycle. So in speaking about process evaluation, we're linking this to stage like we talked about in our last video, and we're really talking about the time of a program when we're either innovating or forming the program, or it's being refined. That is the two left columns in this graphic here. And so we're going to be focusing on the strategies or activity that cause change. Remember, programs are about bringing about change. So why should we bother with process evaluation? I think it's a great question because often when we think about evaluation, what comes to mind is outcome evaluation. But I would argue that process evaluation and it's the different types, that is formative, implementation, and process evaluation, are really critical to understanding a program. So almost every program have at least one implementation failure. And implementation evaluation, which is a type of process evaluation, will minimize these implementation failures by uncovering these failures and then monitoring their correction. Formative evaluation, another type of process evaluation, helps to test some of the less developed components of programs. Fidelity assessments, they ensure that we adhere to our program theory of change, have been shown to increase the effectiveness of programs. So you really stick to that theory of change and you're going to have a more effective program. And then finally, a process evaluation facilitates the interpretation of the outcome evaluation findings. Now I want to spend an extra minute on implementation evaluation. It has arrived on the scene later than the other types of evaluation, but for very good reason. Why? Literature reviews have shown that there are 3 fatal flaws that sadly occur commonly. One is that individuals who are supposed to receive treatment are receiving too little of it, like the dose is too low, or they're actually receiving the wrong treatment. The logic model describes something, but the clients are receiving something, but not what's described in the logic model. Or you have many groups that you're trying to serve, and that treatment is not standardized across those groups. What does this lead to? This leads to type 3 error. Not sure if you've heard of that, but you're hearing about it now. It's evaluating a program that was described, say, in your logic model, but that program was not implemented. And that can occur as much as 75% of the time when you have a program. Okay, so this should be sending off some alarms in your head about programs and the proportion of time that an implementation failure occurs. The other piece to know that the literature has taught us recently is that a meta-analysis that was looking at the different ways in which we reveal a program or roll it out makes a big difference in terms of whether and how We can increase knowledge, skills, say in a training, or its use in the practice setting. Now, this comes from the educational sector, and so that's why the third column down here is about use in the classroom. So if your manager, say, just says, hey, we're going to start doing things differently, what you'll have is an increase in knowledge, but just a 10% increase in knowledge and not really very much increase in skill, and you're not going to see any of that in a practice setting. If you add to that announcement a demonstration in a training, this is how we're going to do things differently. You see a little bump in skill demonstration, but you don't see a bump in use in the practice setting. How about if you add to those two things practice and feedback in a training? So in the training, you get hands-on. Well, you get a pretty big bump in knowledge, and you get a big bump in skill demonstration. Both of those show up at about 60%, but in the practice setting, you don't really see it happening. If you add to all of that actual coaching in the practice setting, you see almost 100% increase in knowledge, same with skill demonstration, and you actually see those skills and knowledge used in the classroom. Okay, that's good news, isn't it? Well, there's some bad news with that too, because 80% of programs really are just, it comes from information shared by a manager that tomorrow we're going to be doing things differently. So that is very concerning, and that is why we need implementation evaluation. Okay, so let's think about the kinds of questions that we would be asking if we're doing a formative implementation or process evaluation. So I've got 4 categories of questions here. I'm going to tell you a little bit about what you might collect, say if you're interested in whether the intended population group is actually receiving services or attending. You might want to know who enrolls. You might want to know who declines. I'll let you read all of these bullets underneath these questions. I won't read each of them for you, but you'll get an idea of the kinds of information you might collect. Maybe as you're reading these, think about where might you get this information. So are the clients getting or completing or benefiting from the intervention? So who actually gets and completes the services? And do we see any changes in their intermediary outcomes that we might have identified in our theory of change? Also, there's some staff questions that we might ask about their preparation and their training. And then finally, we might want to know how the program performs on fidelity assessments. And we already talked about the importance of fidelity assessments. Okay, I do want to mention that we can't totally divorce a process evaluation from a summative evaluation. Back here to our stages, if you're actually being brought in toward the end of a program, let's say while a program is now stabilized and in steady state, and you're asked to do an evaluation, definitely ask whether a process evaluation was completed. And if it wasn't, try and complete one. It will help you improve your ability to interpret your outcome evaluation findings. Moreover, if the process evaluation is actually coordinated with the outcome evaluation, you're going to minimize data collection burden because you're not going to collect the same information twice. Also, you're going to ensure that you're collecting the right process data for your outcome evaluation. So by all means, try and coordinate with a process evaluation if you're doing the outcome evaluation. So I want to show you here a framework that is displayed in a very useful article, More, and I'll try and include that in the Google Drive. This is the focus of process evaluation issues. So the blue boxes illustrate what we focus on when we do a process evaluation. We've already talked a lot about implementation. We've talked some about using a process evaluation to determine the mechanism of impact. We haven't actually talked yet about the importance of context. So context can influence how and whether implementation goes well, whether there are barriers to implementation. It might even influence the mechanism of impact. It can facilitate or it can act as a barrier to facilitating those mechanisms of impact. And so it's important to consider context when you're doing process evaluation as well. Let me give you an example. Right now, we are living under the influence of the COVID-19 pandemic. That has changed our lives drastically. So you can imagine that any program going on now that involves services, face-to-face services, in-person services, are greatly impacted. And so that would be context that would influence both implementation and potentially mechanism of impact. Now we're going to get to how we're going to do a process evaluation. So I want to mention a few things. First, often a process evaluation is the place to be thinking about mixed methods, that is, qualitative and quantitative. Formative evaluations in particular are often considered pilot studies, so we don't have to worry as much about making sure that we meet rigorous study design standards. Now, for implementation and process evaluation, definitely consider mixed methods, quantitative and qualitative methods, because you don't only want to know how much, you want to know what perspectives are of staff or clients. And you want to make sure that you're using sound designs when you're doing implementation and process evaluation. Now, I'm not going to tell you much about quantitative methods because that's what you're trained in, but I do want to say a few words about qualitative methods. So for qualitative methods, recall that we're really talking about getting descriptions of people's perceptions of an issue. It's not about measuring how big or small a problem is. That's what we use quantitative methods for. And there's most likely you're going to have to do primary data collection for qualitative data collection. Rarely are there secondary sources of qualitative information just hanging around that you can analyze, sadly. But sometimes client records and the notes in client records can be a source of qualitative information that you might be able to tap into and analyze. And so there's a variety of different methods that you can consider, everything from focus groups. Key informant interviews are really one-on-one interviews. You can do open-ended questions in surveys that you might conduct. You might consider concept mapping. So there's a variety of qualitative methods that you can mobilize. Some of these are rapid methods as well, as well as rapid methods of analysis that you can use to get information about the way in which a program is implemented. Okay, so we're at the summary then. Process evaluation can ensure that implementation goes well and helps evaluators avoid that type 3 error, right? We want to make sure that what we're evaluating was actually implemented. So evaluation funds can be a challenge. Often we can't evaluate everything that we want to. So my advice would be to argue hard for some type of implementation or process evaluation. Because quite frankly, if you only do an outcome evaluation and if the statistics I presented to you are to be believed, then implementation failures are going to happen for most programs. I would rather spend my money making sure that implementation goes well rather than doing an outcome evaluation where you can't rely on the findings because you're not sure if the program was even implemented. And then finally, one way to think about implementation and process evaluation is as an opportunity to guarantee that a program is going to meet its goals by using some of that data to inform mid-course corrections. Alrighty, so now I want you to think about a few questions. First, what questions do you have about process evaluation? If you have a program in mind that you're working on or considering for this course, what is the rationale for doing a process evaluation? And then finally, what types of data collection or methodological approaches do you know the least about that you would like to learn more about so that you might undertake a strong process evaluation? So don't forget to write down the answers to these questions. Make sure that you get them to me somehow. I'm hoping to have a place on the Google Drive where you can just put your questions there so that I can be prepared to answer your questions on July 20th. See you then.